Hi, everybody. This is Professor John Gillespie, and this is my video presentation on what I'm calling servants, slaves, planters, and preachers, or turning points in the history of colonial America, starting about 1660 and going right up to the eve of the French and Indian War, right about 1760. This is also part one of a two-part series on colonial America. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to start by doing a colonial overview and laying some of the foundations, looking at how the colonies developed and why, each of the 13 colonies. And then we're going to move on to some of the episodes that took place within American history, within the colonial period of American history, and laid the political, the religious, and the social foundation, and also the economic foundation for the country that is going to become the United States. So let's get started with an overview of the 13 colonies. Well, if you look at a map, by 1733, England had settled 13 distinct colonies in North America. Now, these were not all settled by the same type of people. They were settled by different folks for different reasons, ranging from economic prosperity to religious freedom to just wanting to start a better life somewhere else. So the colonies that are colored in purple up there are the northern colonies, sometimes called the New England colonies, and they include Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. And as we learned in our lecture on the founding of English America, these were settled mainly for religious reasons. The first folks to come over in 1620 were Puritans, which were dissenters from the Anglican Church. They wanted to set up their own religious society in America. And the folks that spread out from New England and founded places like Rhode Island or Connecticut were primarily dissenters from the dissenters. And they founded churches like Baptists and things like that. And so we'll get into them in a little bit. But if you go further south, then you'll see what's called the mid-Atlantic colonies, or sometimes just called the middle colonies. And these include the colonies such as New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. And they were settled for primarily commercial reasons, meaning New York is a big trading center. Pennsylvania is going to become a breadbasket and it's going to sell those grains for the market. But also they tend to be very tolerant and very accepting of diversity. Just like you look at New York today, it's a very tolerant and accepting place. Go further south, and we lose some of that tolerance and diversity. And we talk about the southern or the plantation colonies. Those would be Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia. And these were settled for one reason only, for the most part: large scale agriculture. We're talking about cash crops, staple crops, crops that can be sold on the world market. At first, it's tobacco. And then we get into rice and indigo, and later on, cotton becomes the major cash crop that they're going to export. Another distinctive feature of the southern colonies is that they become increasingly dependent on slavery as they become more and more established, and we will look at that in later lectures. So let's move on to the first colony. So, as we know, the first English colony in North America was Virginia. Jamestown was founded in 1607 by a joint stock company called the Virginia Company, and the purpose was to make money. They were supposed to go out and find gold and make the investors who helped the expedition possible wealthy. Well, gold never happened for them, but they did find quite a bit of tobacco, and that was the staple crop that got them off the ground. So it was chartered by King James I in 1606, promising them the rights of Englishmen, or the idea that just because they are living, or as the case may be, born in Virginia, they still retain all of the same rights that other English people retain in England. Their governmental structure is called the House of Burgesses, which we look to is the beginnings of American democracy, the first representative body in English America, in which property owning white men will meet and legislate on affairs that affect the entire colony. And in 1624, because the colony was so profitable, it became a royal colony, meaning that it was put under the direct control of the king. But the House of Burgesses continued to function, although the king retained veto. Well, as we mentioned, and I put in very large red letters there, by the 1630s, Virginia is a recognized economic powerhouse because of the cash crop tobacco, which is sold on the world market and is highly sought after by people with means in Europe. They like to smoke it, and it's sort of a status symbol. Interestingly, King James I did not much care for tobacco. He said, "It's a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian pit of the pit Hades, that is bottomless." So no, he didn't care too much for the crop that was making his colonies so wealthy. So the next one we're going to look at is Maryland, founded in 1634. It was founded by Lord Baltimore, who was a wealthy Englishman, and he was also a Roman Catholic. And he intended the colony of Maryland as a haven for English Catholics. And you can sort of discern that by looking at the name, Mary Land, as in the Virgin Mary. This was the first proprietary colony. That is, it was given to a ruler, but still accountable to English law and custom. And one of the highlights of Maryland's settlement is because they were Catholics and because they were used to being persecuted back in England, the folks who set it up, Lord Baltimore included, set up the Maryland Act of Religious Toleration in 1649. And here is a part of that. No person or persons professing to believe in Jesus Christ shall henceforth be anyways troubled, molested, or discountenanced for or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof within this province. So the Maryland Act of Toleration is unique in colonial history because it grants religious freedom if you are a Christian. So yeah, not everybody's included. We're not going to accept Muslims in Maryland at this time or Jews into Maryland at this time, but we can say it is a promising step toward religious freedom in the colonies. So we want to go further south and look at North and South Carolina, founded as one colony at first in 1663. It was founded by English nobility, that is, as a reward for those people who had remained faithful to the crown during the English Civil Wars. And so it was called a restoration colony. Carolina is a derivative of Charles, named for King Charles, who resumed leadership of the English state. The plan was to duplicate the sugar and the rice plantations of Barbados, which had been greatly successful. And that also included replicating the slave system that existed in those places as well. Interestingly, and I do want you to make a note of this, the um, the fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas, or the laws by which the Carolinas are going to be governed, was written by the famous English philosopher John Locke. And John Locke is going to exercise no small influence on the development of American political thought. When Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he gives Locke full credit for its thoughts, calling it pure Locke. So John Locke is most famous for advocating limited government, or a form of government that simply cannot do whatever it wants, but is governed itself by the rule of law. The French philosophe Voltaire, who you may have heard of in another class, said, "Cast your eyes over the other hemisphere. Behold, Carolina, of which the wise Locke was legislator." And he meant by that his his innovation of limited government, the idea that government should be kept in within certain bounds and not allowed to simply do as it likes. But just because government was limited, this did not mean that the fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas were egalitarian. In fact, they were far from egalitarian. Remember, the purpose of establishing the Carolinas was to make money in agriculture. And to that end, every freeman, says Article 10 of the fundamental constitutions, of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, of what opinion or religion whatsoever. So here we have, at the same time, a bold declaration of limited government, which we Americans tend to cherish. We also have a more embarrassing declaration of racist slavery, that Negro slaves, no matter who they are, will be we will exercise absolute power over them. Well, we move on back to the north, Massachusetts, 1620, 1629. There are really two separate foundings there. The first was under William Bradford in 1620. He led a group of separatist Puritans that wanted to separate from the Church of England and go read the Bible and tend to their own affairs unmolested. And then you have a second founding, so to speak, by John Winthrop, who led the colonists in the Massachusetts to the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that was in 1629. He intending to set up a city on a hill for everyone to look at and follow. As we mentioned, the motive of the northern colonies was religious. And so when they got there, they set up a theocratic government, or a government run by the church. Male members with property, which tends to be the norm in Europe in the 17th century, are the voting members of the theocratic government that they set up. They met their economic means through shipping, shipbuilding, maritime trade, fishing, and small shopkeeping. You're not going to see the large scale agricultural ventures that you're going to see down south, but of course they did engage in agriculture. You have to. John Winthrop in 1630 gives a very good summation of what the Puritans intended to found up there in Massachusetts. He tells his followers on the ship the Arbella before disembarking, he says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." So we have a job to do because everybody's looking. We are the frozen chosen, says John Winthrop. So the next colony we want to look at is Connecticut, founded in 1635. This was founded by a guy named Thomas Hooker. Thomas Hooker left Massachusetts because he believed John Winthrop was a tyrant, an authoritarian ruler under whom true liberty could not flourish. So again, once again, as with the founders of Massachusetts, the motive is religion, but there's sort of a secondary move here, which is government. The government that Thomas Hooker set up was going to be governed by, or was accountable to, a written document. And this is something you should make a note of. A written document called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was put in its final form in 1639. Now, this is really important because the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is the first written constitution in the entire world. Okay, so it is a very important document. The idea that constitutions should be written down so that somebody can reference them. We can go back and say, hey, I know what the laws are. It doesn't matter how much money I have or how much social standing I have. I can read, therefore interpret the laws of the land. This is important. So it provided for the elections of representatives and church members, and also including non-church members. So we're witnessing another important hallmark in the history of American political thought. The idea that, hey, maybe anybody who lives here should have some kind of say in how the laws are going to be governed, not just the elect, as the Puritans would think. So Thomas Hooker has a good quote. You can hashtag it. "The foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people." And of course, Thomas Hooker means all of the people, not just church members, not just people with money. Rhode Island was founded in 1636 with an interesting history. They called it the Sewer, or Rogues Island, because it seemed to attract a lot of folks that had been tossed out of other places, like Roger Williams, who in 1636 was banished from Massachusetts for his teaching that church and state should be separate. That was the distinctive feature of Rhode Island, is it set up an absolute distinction between church and state. And not the official religion, of course, we can't say that, but Roger Williams set up the first Baptist church in America. Also, all property-owning men could vote, whether or not you were a member of a particular religion or not. But again, we are talking about property-owning white men, which is the standard in the 17th century. Roger Williams tells us that God requireth, or God does not require, a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state, which enforced uniformity sooner or later is the greatest occasion of civil war, ravishing of conscience, persecution of Christ Jesus and his servants, and of the hypocrisy and destruction of millions of souls. So Roger Williams founding Rhode Island because he does not much care for the theocratic state that Winthrop had set up in Massachusetts. New Amsterdam. You're thinking, wait a minute, we have a colony called New Amsterdam? Well, we do. It's not actually the English that govern it in 1625, but New Amsterdam is going to become what we call New York. It was founded by the Dutch in 1625 as a trading center. And although you think of New York as big money, Wall Street, right? Never as profitable as they had hoped. It was remarkably diverse, though. It was somewhere where all sorts of religious dissenters could flock to, and they didn't have to worry about having their heads chopped off or being burned. And one particularly intolerant Protestant minister complained that papists, that is, Catholics, papists, Mennonites, and Lutherans among the Dutch, and many Puritans, and many other atheists who conceal themselves under the name of Christians. So he doesn't much care for this diversity. Well, nevertheless, because it wasn't very profitable, the Dutch sold it to the English in 1644, and they promptly renamed it New York. Charles I gave authority to his brother, the Duke of York, for which the colony takes its name. And he decided to continue the policy of diversity and of tolerance. And the official bylaws of the colony says all persons of what religion soever are permitted quietly to inhabit, provided they give no disturbance to the public peace, nor do molest or disquiet others in the free exercise of their religion. So you can see religion is a major concern of the folks that are settling these colonies, and what they're having to come to terms with is the fact that lots of folks are coming over for lots of different reasons, and religious tolerance is not only going to be necessary, but also it's going to become quite enjoyable. You know, the idea that, hey, I don't have to have my head cut off for believing this or that, or not believing this or that. Well, New York is established among the 13 English colonies as a commercial center, a diverse center, and a tolerant center. And that you look at New York, and that's kind of what it is today, right? New Jersey is founded in 1664. That's because York, after whom the Duke of York, after whom New York is named for, granted the territory between the Hudson and Delaware rivers to two of his friends, and these two friends could not agree on how to govern. So they turned to a Quaker, which is a religious order, a Quaker named William Penn, to arbitrate. And Penn did come up with a settlement that helped to found the colony of New Jersey in 1664. And in doing so, William Penn traveled in America, and he became really interested in establishing what he called a holy experiment for members of his own faith, which are the Quakers. And so he set his sights on land just to the west of New Jersey, and it will soon be called Pennsylvania. So I think in the history of Pennsylvania, we have to stop and talk about who the Quakers are. Who are these guys, Quakers? Well, Quakers are a Christian sect come out of the Protestant Reformation, just like Lutherans or Anglicans or Mennonites. They're a Christian group. They're formally known not as Quakers, but as the Society of Friends. They believe in a loving God who reveals himself to each individual through an inner light, that is, the light of conscience, which is considered to be more authoritative than that of Scripture. Another interesting characteristic of the Quakers is that they make no distinction based on gender. Both men and women can hold positions of authority within the church, can preach and teach, and that is not something that, say, the Puritans or the Anglicans would approve of. And another distinctive feature of the Quakers is that they're pacifists. They don't believe in fighting and refuse military service, and that gets them in a lot of trouble with some of the folks back in England that they want to settle among. Also, Quakers refuse to acknowledge social rank. They remove their hats in the presence of anyone, whether you're a king or whether you're a pauper. Everybody is one in Christ Jesus, so they say. And another interesting characteristic of Quakers is that they are abolitionists. They abhor slavery and were the first organized abolitionists in the American colonies. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a transcendentalist writer in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, said, "The sect of the Quakers, in their best representatives, appear to me to have come nearer to the sublime history and genius of Christ than any of the other sects." So now we move on to Pennsylvania, which was formally founded by William Penn in 1661. Charles II made Penn the proprietor of 45,000 square miles called Pennsylvania, and it's going to grow beyond that. And it is very diverse, very egalitarian. And Penn wrote in 1685 that Pennsylvanians are a collection of diverse nations in Europe, as French, Dutch, Germans, Swedes, Danes, Finns, and Scotch Irish, and English, and of the last equal to the rest, meaning Penn really focuses on equality and egalitarianism. Like New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians are quite commercially minded. They became a breadbasket to not only the rest of the colonies, but also to the West Indies, exporting grain and other foods there to make money. And still, even though Penn is a believer in religious tolerance, he still believes that the purpose of government is to enforce morality. So he writes, "For there is no power but of God. The power that be are ordained by God. Whoever so therefore resists the power of government resists the ordinance of God." So you can still see that although he's very much a modern man, very democratic, very tolerant, William Penn still has one foot in the 17th century. So we get to the last colony we founded, which is Georgia in 1733. King George II, from which the colony takes its name, granted a man named James Oglethorpe and 114 of his followers, the colonists, to a section of land at the southernmost point of the English claim. Their motto is "Sin sibi sed aliis," which translates to "not for self, but for others." You see, Georgia was established not to be a large-scale agricultural colony, but as a philanthropical colony. The purpose is to give the worthy poor, and I put that in quotes there, the worthy poor of England a new start in the new world. Give them a plot of land, give them some farming equipment, give them a horse, and see how far they can take it. Slavery is going to be prohibited in Georgia up until 1751 anyway. And the idea behind that is that if you bring in big slave plantations and you take, you have all this free labor, then the common man cannot get ahead because he cannot compete with slave labor. Also, the Crown looked at the foundation of Georgia as a buffer between English and Spanish colonies, and so it also has a military application as well. James Oglethorpe gives his vision for the founding of Georgia as this. He says, "In America, there are fertile lands sufficient to subsist all the useless poor in England and distressed Protestants in Europe. Yet thousands starve for want of mere subsistence. If people were set down in America and the land before them, they must cut down trees, build houses, fortify towns, dig and sow the land before they can get in a harvest. And until then, they must be provided with food and kept together. so that they may be assistant to each other for their natural support and protection. So, as you can see, Georgia was first established as a philanthropic colony to help poor men get ahead. It was also known as the debtors' colony. So, um, if we sum this up, in 1782, a French immigrant named Michel Crevecoeur writes, "Who then is this American, this new man? He is either an he is either an European or the descendant of an European. Hence, that strange mixture of blood which you shall find in no other country." Well, okay, not quite so fast, Crevecoeur. We're forgetting some folks who also helped to colonize the North American New World, and these are some of the folks that did not come here altogether willingly. Those would be the free and enslaved population. So while the population jumps from 300,000 in 1700, you have 20,000 black colonists who came unwillingly to 2.5 million. Now, 400,000 of these folks were indentured servants, who are generally white Europeans who are also considered to be unfree. So the big takeaway is by 1770, about 25 to 30%, some people say more, of the American population was either enslaved or otherwise unfree. So there are some things that I want you to note about the English colonies. First, you can gather from the graph to your right that they're just about half English. Around 49% of the settlers can actually claim pure English ancestry. 1/5, that is almost 20% of the inhabitants, were of African descent. Most of these are going to be enslaved people, but there are a fair number of free blacks, so to speak, as well. The colonial population is going to be doubling about every 25 years between 1700 and the eve of the Revolution in 1770. Most of this is going to come from natural increase or natural reproduction, although immigration is certainly going to play a part as well. The average age in the colonies is 16, so it's a very young population, and the bulk of the population lives east of the Allegheny Mountains. 90% of which live in rural areas. By 1770, the English to colonist ratio was 3-1, telling you that the colonies are multiplying and multiplying quickly. So, how did the colonies relate to the mother country on an economic level? Well, in theory, the purpose of the colonies was to benefit the empire financially. The colonies were supposed to generate tax revenue for the English merchants and shippers. They were also to divert colonies' trade from England's enemies, the Dutch and the French. And so, in short, the colonies were not supposed to function as independent economies. They were not supposed to be making money for themselves. They were supposed to function as an adjunct member of the greater British Empire and benefit the empire as a whole. After all, goods from the colonies accounted for about 1/5 of all English imports. And this is important. A large portion of English commercial industry is dependent on these raw materials, such as lumber, such as fish, such as indigo, such as rice, such as tobacco. All of these are going to be driving English industry. And without American imports, then the British economy doesn't function quite as well. And so independent colonial industry would offset this arrangement. If the colonies were to decide, hey, we're not going to be part of this arrangement anymore, we're going to sell to who we want, when we want, at what prices we want, well, that would put the English economy into a tailspin. Nevertheless, you do have people who start to argue that this is not the best arrangement. One of them's name is Edmund Burke. And we're going to hear some more about Edmund Burke as we get closer and closer to the revolution. He says to Parliament, "Young man, there is America, which at this day serves for little more than to amuse you with stories of savage men and uncouth manners, yet shall before you taste of death show itself equal to the world of that commerce which now attracts the envy of the world." So Americans were part of a larger global empire called the triangle trade. The triangle trade functions like this. You're going to have gold and enslaved people are going to be traded for European goods, European and American goods on the African continent, and then shipped to North America and to the West Indies, where they're going to work where the enslaved people are going to work to produce raw materials, and those raw materials are going to be bound for Europe. And so we're talking about things like sugar and tobacco and cotton and indigo and hemp and some of these other things that the Americans are going to produce and they're going to send to English industry. Then English industry is going to take those things, going to take those raw materials, and they're going to manufacture goods to be sold in Africa, once again for gold and enslaved people, seeing how this forms something of a triangle, hence the name, the triangle trade. It is part of a theory called mercantilism. Mercantilism. That is an economic theory that we've been discussing but have not yet given a name. Mercantilism says that a nation's economic worth is measured in precious metals such as gold or silver. We call that bullion. And the purpose of colonies exists for the economic benefit of the mother countries. So once again, I want to underscore the point that the colonies are supposed to be a subservient part of the greater economic machine. They are supposed to supply the raw materials that will be manufactured in Europe, in England in this case, and then be sold on the market for the greater benefit of the empire. So now let's take a closer look at how England is going to conduct this mercantilistic policy with regard to its colonies. It's really pretty simple. You've got the 13 English colonies on one side of the Atlantic, and you've got England on the other. New England is going to provide things like wood and fur and whale oil, fish, cattle, and grain, among other things. The middle colonies, wood, furs, fish, cattle, wheat, iron, and of course other things. And the southern colonies, primarily agricultural goods, tobacco, cotton, indigo, rice, and corn. Now, the relationship between England and the colonies is like this. You give those things to us, and we will sell them back to you in the form of manufactured goods. And so you can see the industry there is primarily on the side of England, and the harvesting of raw materials is on the side of the colonies. So mercantilism is supposed to be a theory and a practice that works for everyone's benefit. You see, the purpose is to ensure a favorable balance of trade. That means sell more stuff to Africa and to the Americas and even to other Europeans than you spend. So just think of it as a scale. We want to sell more than we buy. We want to bring in more money or gold and silver than we spend getting this stuff. It's supposed to supply the colonies with a ready supply of work with guaranteed compensation. And that's supposed to be to the colonies' benefit, right? London will pay generously for American shipping and for lumber and for other raw materials. And tobacco farmers are going to have a monopoly within the empire with guaranteed prices. And for this to work, though, everybody has to keep to this arrangement, right? If the colonists go and they seek other markets, such as England's enemies like the Dutch or the French, then they would cut into English profits. And the balance of trade, which mercantilism is supposed to protect, would be disrupted. So to ensure that the balance of trade is kept favorable to the mother country, Parliament passes what is known collectively as the Navigation Acts. Several of these are going to be put in place between 1650 and 1663. Generally speaking, they say this. It's to keep as much trade within the empire as possible. And so all trade outside of the empire has to go through England, that is, through the approval of Parliament, and everything that's going to be traded within the colonies has to come on English ships and has to use English crews. The colonies, as you can imagine, are forbidden to trade with countries other than England. You see, they don't exist for their own benefit. They don't exist on a free market. They exist as a subordinate part of the greater English economy. Now, in return, England promises to keep the colonies busy harvesting raw materials. So England is going to give a government contracts, so to speak, and the colonies are going to um, fulfill those contracts, and there will be a guaranteed supply of goods flowing from the colonies to England. And then, of course, in reverse, you're going to have the manufactured goods and money, of course, going back to the colonies. Um, well, here's the problem with the Navigation Acts is that they were very loosely enforced. Starting in about 1714, um, the English crown realized that enforcing the Navigation Acts is very difficult. The cost of doing so actually outweighs the benefits. The colonies were still generating a lot of wealth. So, as King George II said, why don't we just let sleeping dogs lie? And this is what we mean by salutary neglect. It's an unofficial policy of allowing the colonies to operate independently. And we're just kind of turned a blind eye when they start trading with, say, the French or the Dutch or somebody like that. Edmund Burke, once again, the member of parliament who was somewhat sympathetic to the colonists, summed up this policy in 1775 on the eve of the Revolution. He says, I know that the colonies owe little or nothing to any care of ours, and that they are not squeezed into this happy form like by the constraints of watchful and suspicious government, but that through a wise and salutary neglect, a generous nature has been suffered to take her own way to perfection. When I reflect upon these efforts, I see how profitable they have been to us. Well, let's look at the Chesapeake then and look at one of the major developments in the history of colonial America. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. So, the majority of migrants, people who came from Europe to the Chesapeake, were indentured servants. That means that these are people who had signed a contract which committed them to 5 to 7 years of labor in exchange for what was called their freedom dues. And their freedom dues is usually some land and maybe some startup cash. It would vary from contract to contract, but the overriding principle is that you essentially give up your freedom in exchange for land in 5 to 7 years. Now, these folks are here in America, in Virginia, and in Maryland to plant and harvest tobacco, which is very labor intensive. And so they're going to supply the necessary labor for this growing economy based on tobacco. These are very rarely free people, despite of what you may have heard in the fifth or seventh or eighth grade. These are not folks who simply signed on in hopes of a better life in America, and they did this freely and voluntarily. These are usually people who have no other option available to them. They're folks like convicts, possibly facing the death sentence, debtors who have no hope of getting out of debtor's prison in England, orphans who have very little other recourse other than to do this, and perhaps would be sold by the orphanage for a little bit of cash. These are people without means and without a whole lot of other options. And so we can gauge some of the documents, we can gauge how they're treated by looking at some of the surviving documents about indentured servitude. Here's one from the Virginia Gazette. A servant's a servant girl's time to be disposed of, having about, and that's not a misspelling, 2 years and 4 months to serve, is very fit for coarse work, spins exceedingly well, and would do good for country business. Terms apply to James Plunkett there. So James Plunkett's putting out an ad to sell his servant girl. And that's interesting here because it's an ad in a paper advertising the sale of a person, right? Um, let's look at another one. This one's even more blunt. To be sold, a Scotch servant's girl's time, who has almost 4 years to serve. She's had the smallpox and is remarkably strong and healthy, fit for town or country business. So, in other words, here, they're not hiding the language. This is a Scottish girl who's going to be sold. And look at how she is advertised. She's had the smallpox, which means she's likely not going to get sick from this and is going to be a good investment. 4 years left on her contract. And so this means that she can be sold to anyone with the money willing to buy out her contract. Look at this one. Just arrived at Leedstown, the ship Justia, with about 100 healthy servants, men, women, and boys. The sale will commence on Tuesday, the 2nd of April, says the Virginia Gazette. Once again, we notice that this is a sale of people, men, women, and boys. And it sounds, if you're thinking, this sounds a whole lot like a slave auction that you may have heard about in another class or read about somewhere else, you'd be right. They are similar. These folks are going to be auctioned off as commodities. These are Europeans. These are not enslaved Africans. These are folks without a whole lot of money, without a whole lot of other opportunities. And so this form of servitude, very close to a form of slavery, is what they find themselves in. Well, we turn back to the Chesapeake and we look at some of the problems that are going to arise in the mid 1670s. You've got too many planters that have moved into Virginia. And when you have too many folks out there growing too much tobacco, that actually depresses the tobacco prices. On top of that, many servants who have moved out there are coming to the end of their 5 to 7 year contract and they're starting to collect their freedom dues. And so they are moving further west. As they move further west, they come into conflict with Native Americans over land because this is what they want to do. When they become free, they say, I want to become a planter. I want some land. I want to make some money. And of course, that brings you into conflict with the people who actually are on that land, which are the Native Americans. Then you have those navigation acts, which had been passed by Parliament back in 1650. Now, this is before the age of salutary neglect. So we're going to be taking these navigation acts seriously in 1650. So the navigation acts, as you know, prohibits Dutch ships from trading with the English colonies. And what that does is that makes farming equipment and supplies more expensive for the Virginians because you're not able to go and bargain for a better price with the Dutch and go and haggle. You have actually got to buy from one source now, that being the English. So how do we deal with these problems? If you're a wealthy planter, these are certainly issues that you don't want to deal with, right? Because now you've got depressed tobacco prices. You've got all these people demanding more land to move further west, which is going to depress prices more. And now here's Parliament raising the price on your farming equipment. So this is really going to cut into your bottom line. So the governor, William Berkeley, he's the governor of Virginia. He says, all right, look, I've got some solutions. And he presents these solutions to the House of Burgesses. He says, why don't we do this? Let's raise property taxes on newly purchased land. That means that some of those recent freedmen, those recently freed indentured servants, when they go to purchase their land and raise crops, they're going to find themselves slapped with a larger tax bill than the folks that came before them. That's not going to be good for them. Here's another thing they're going to do. He's going to sign a treaty with the Indians, meaning recognize the Indians' rights to Western land. Now, you think, oh, this is a good thing. This helps the Native Americans. And from one perspective, sure, it seems very just. But what it does is it limits the amount of land that is available for cultivation. So once again, think about yourself as a recently freed indentured servant. You're going to buy your own land, and you find that not only is there less land available, which raises the prices, but you've got to pay those higher property taxes on newly purchased lands. The other thing that Governor Berkeley does is he raises the property requirement to vote. And so if you're one of these newly freed freemen, you think you're going to go out and purchase some land. Well, what you're going to find out is that your property taxes are raised, there's less land available, and hey, well, I'll just go petition the House of Burgesses for a change. I don't even have a vote, right? So you are being squeezed out of your political power, and you're being squeezed out of your economic power too. So all of these things that Governor Berkeley and the House of Burgesses does is all of this works in favor of the established rich, the people who already own land. And what it does is it forces those freed servants who are expecting their freedom dues to re-indenture, go and sign another contract, another 5 to 7 years. We'll see how it works out. Well, one guy enters into the scene who doesn't like this idea one bit. He's a planter, and his name is Nathaniel Bacon. And in 1676, he openly defies Governor Berkeley and the House of Burgesses, saying, Berkeley has protected, favored, and emboldened the Indians against His Majesty's loyal subjects, never contriving, requiring, or appointing any due or proper means of satisfaction for their many invasions, robberies, and murders committed upon us. Bacon then rallies an army of small planters, freedmen, and also freed slaves. And they demand, the House of Burgesses, that the Western lands be open to settlement. And when the House of Burgesses declines, they simply march on Jamestown and they burn the city to the ground. Well, Bacon's rebellion actually didn't get too far. Bacon suddenly died of disease in the midst of it, leaving the rebellion without a leader. Governor Berkeley quickly raised an army and crushed the rebels, and he wrote, I have lived 34 years amongst you Virginians, as uncorrupted, diligent as ever a governor was. Sure. While Bacon was a man 2 years amongst you, his person and qualities unknown to most of you, and to all men else, by any virtuous act that I have ever heard of. I will take counsel of wiser men than myself, but Mr. Bacon has none about him but the lowest of people. So he's really insulting Bacon's associates and saying, this Mr. Bacon, he just associates with the lowest of folk. So who are these lowest of people? But here's what the Virginia legislator noticed about these low people who made up Bacon's army. One, they were all poor men. They were all landless men. They were also, interestingly, multiracial. They were black and they were white. And here's a telling detail about how they were treated. 23 men were hanged as a result of Bacon's rebellion. And black men and white men received the same sentence. And this speaks to the treatment of blacks and whites in colonial Virginia. There doesn't seem to be, at least in this instance, a real hard and fast line separating the treatment of white and black. And if you know anything about the history of slavery and the history of race relations in the United States, that is certainly not going to stay the case. But right now, there's sort of an equality of sentence, right? So here's how the Virginia legislature is going to address this problem. Right after Bacon's rebellion in 1676, the House of Burgesses is going to pass some laws that are going to increase the rights of white indentured servants. By 1680, the head right system, which was the system by which indentured servants were imported into the New World, it's going to be curbed. And so it's going to limit the number of servants that one can sponsor and bring into the country, which is going to limit the overall number of white indentured servants that we have in Virginia. And what that's going to do is that's going to make it's going to give these indentured servants more economic power because there is less of them. By 1705, you're going to see a law passed requiring masters to provide 50 acres of land, 30 shillings, and 10 bushels of corn and gun to all white laborers. Notice the emphasis on the white laborers. This is not happening to the black laborers or to freed Africans. So where is the cheap labor going to come from, you ask? Well, the planters in the Chesapeake and elsewhere, alarmed by the multiracial army that rebelled against the establishment under Nathaniel Bacon, is going to turn to enslaved Africans as a source for labor. Enslaved Africans are further from home, obviously. It's going to make it difficult for them to escape. England's dominance of the slave trade in the 1740s and then in the 1640s and then in the 1670s is going to make slavery cheaper. Also, the enslaved were easily distinguishable from the white freemen. One historian named Edmund Morgan put it this way: once the small planter felt less exploited by taxation and began to prosper a little, he became less turbulent, less dangerous, more respectable. He could begin to see his big neighbor not as an extortionist, but as a powerful protector of their common interest. Uh, if you're noticing that the color line is being drawn, that whiteness is being privileged while blackness is not, then you're right. So, before we talk about slavery in what's going to become the United States and North America, we have to note some important things about the 17th century African slave trade on the African continent. First off, the slave trade on the African continent was a trans Saharan network, and it was conducted by Arabs, by Africans, by Berbers, and by other folks in the region. So Africans did not enslave their own people, as is commonly charged. One African does not necessarily look at another African as the same person. Africa is a diverse continent, not a single country. There are more than 1,000 different languages spoken on the African continent, and they fought with one another and quarreled with one another and do not see themselves as the same people. Also, we do want to note that African slavery was not race based. We don't look at one person or their skin color or their physical characteristics and say, well, this makes you a slave and I'm not. It's not race based. It's also not hereditary, meaning if you are an enslaved person, you do not pass that status on to your children. And also, very rarely is slavery ever permanent. African slaves, people enslaved in Africa, did not expect to remain slaves for life. Who were the enslaved in Africa? And well, could be just about anybody: social outsiders, or infidels, people who don't share your religious beliefs, or people captured in war. Sometimes slavery was voluntary, sometimes it was involuntary. People would often sell themselves into slavery in order to work off a debt or something like that. There are instances of people selling their children into slavery in order to work off a debt. But once again, not race based, not hereditary, and never considered to be permanent. So African slavery was not nice. We can't say that this is a good institution, but it was a limited form of personal service. And in African forms of slavery, the enslaved was regarded as human, as not as property. So the concept of chattel slavery, or people as property, that is not a characteristic of African slavery. Um, some people have likened African forms of slavery in some instances to European feudalism. Yeah, it's not a good situation. You don't want to be at the bottom of the social hierarchy then, but you are not necessarily looked at as a piece of property. Well, this is going to change. So the first instance of Europeans entering the transatlantic slave trade, the African slave trade, was in 1441 when the Portuguese began to purchase people for work on the Madeira Islands. By 1472, this trade had become somewhat regularized or institutionalized, and a ship captain now would regularly trade in gold and ivory and slaves. Now, to the Africans, this represents no new economic activity. The slave trade had been going on since the days of the Roman Empire. So this was just business as usual. And the Portuguese who are entering this trade just represent a new trading partner. Yeah, somebody from further away, but in principle, what's the difference? This is simply a continuation of a centuries old practice. Well, it is going to, by the when the Portuguese begin to enter the African slave trade, they are going to transform it. So by 1450 and 1505, the Portuguese transport approximately 50,000 enslaved people to the Madeira and the Canary Islands for their agricultural work. Now, the nature of this form of slavery does change it. It is different. It is going to change the nature of the transatlantic, or I'm sorry, it's going to change the nature of the African slave trade and transform it into that transatlantic slave trade. John Newton, who is a former English slave trader, notes as he is traveling in Africa, he says, the state of slavery among these wild, barbarous people, as we esteem them, is much milder than in our colonies. For as on the one hand, they have no land in high cultivation, like our West India plantations, and therefore no call for that excessive, unintermitted labor which exhausts our slaves. So, on the one hand, no man is permitted to draw blood, even from a slave. So once established on a large scale, as we have noted, the nature of African slavery alters dramatically. It becomes institutionalized, or that is regularized. And as such, it represents a geo-economic business with big money happening on both sides of the Atlantic. And as the demand increases, so does the criteria for enslavement decrease. That means that is people are commoditized as a dollar sign is attached to people, and that figure grows. That means people's humanity is going to be recognized less and less. So between 1451 and 1600, you have about 275,000 enslaved people are going to be transported to the New World. And that number is relatively small compared to the entire number of people that are going to be that are going to be forcibly transported to the New World by the time the slave trade ends. The English monopolized the slave trade in 1672, taking the place of the Portuguese. And to that end, Charles II, the king, grants the newly formed Royal African Company a near monopoly on slave trading. And this means that for the English colonies, it's a cheaper supply of enslaved people. Then, as we've noted, Bacon's Rebellion happens in 1676, right at the same time that the English begin to monopolize the slave trade. So just as we begin to notice that white indentured servants are difficult to control, causing some problems, the availability of enslaved labor it increases. So African slavery then becomes the preferred and, in quotes, normal way in which labor needs are going to be filled in America. This map gives you an overall picture of how many people are going to be transported forcibly from Africa into the New World between 1500 and 1900. And I do want you to note that the largest single number is going to go to Brazil. And beyond that, the Caribbean. And if you follow that little tiny offshoot there, you're going to see a whole lot or relatively less people going to what is going to be the future United States. So between 1600 and 1800, you're going to see approximately 20 million Africans transported across the Atlantic as part of what's called the Middle Passage. That is that middle leg in the triangle trade, which we spoke of earlier. This is a slave ship, and we'll show you a larger picture of it in just a minute. But as you can see, these are human beings that are packed onto these slave ships as commodities with very little regard for their comfort or safety. These are folks who are commoditized. That is, they are seen as an investment. They're not people to the folks that are transporting them or conducting this horrible trade. They are commodities. And as such, 20% are expected to perish somewhere along the way. Of course, the longer the trip is, the more dangerous it's going to be. So here's a detail of that slave ship that I showed you on the previous slide. And you can see people packed in like cargo, regarded as cargo in that sense. And you can see folks like lining the aisles and stuff. And this is really a horrible condition to find yourself in. And like we said, the mortality rate is going to be somewhere around 20%. One of the contemporary accounts given by one of the folks on the slave ship says the height sometimes between decks was only 18 inches, so that the unfortunate human beings could not turn around or even on their sides, the elevation being less than the breadth of their shoulders. And here are usually chained to the decks by the neck and legs. In such a place, in such a place, the sense of misery and suffocation is so great that the Negroes are driven to frenzy. We have the account of one of these folks who survived the transport. He was an enslaved African named Olaudah Equiano, and Equiano was captured in what is today Nigeria in 1756 by African slave traders, and he was just 11 years old. And he later recalls in his journals, I had never heard of white men or Europeans, nor the sea. I feared I was going to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair. He recalled that most of the enslaved Africans were, as we noted from the map, sold in Barbados, but he went on to what is going to become the United States in Virginia. He ended up being sold to a Quaker, and we find this somewhat ironic because I know I told you on a previous slide that Quakers don't believe in slavery, but well, you know what? There's exceptions to every rule. And anyway, he was sold to a Quaker, and this Quaker man promised that he may purchase his freedom once he acquires enough money. And he did so in 1765 at the age of 20. And Equiano goes on to write, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, which was what his name was changed to when he was enslaved. The Gustavus Vasa, the African, in 1789, interestingly, the same year that George Washington becomes president of the United States. This narrative, one of the earlier slave narratives that we have, is one of the reasons why the British decided to end the slave trade in 1807. Well, now we look at the curious case of a man named Antonio Johnson, who in his earlier years was simply known as Antonio the Negro. Now, Antonio tells us a lot about the development of slavery in the Chesapeake. So I want you to follow his story very carefully because we're going to use it to try to reconstruct the condition of many enslaved people in early 17th century Virginia. So we see Antonio here, or Antonio the Negro. And that's not actually a picture of him to the right. That's an artist's imagining of the man. We don't know what he looked like. But he was born in what is today Angola. And for some reason, and we don't know, he ended up in slavery sometime around 1618. He was one of the first 20 enslaved Africans brought to Virginia by a Dutch trader in 1619. So he was among the first Africans to be delivered to the United States by a Dutch trader in Virginia. And historians have been trying to reconstruct his status, his social status, his legal status. Was he a slave? Was he a servant? Was he a slave for life? Did he see himself as a slave for life? Did he imagine that one day he was going to be free? Did he think that his children would inherit his slave status? You know, these are things that we try to figure out to try to discern the nature of 17th century slavery. Well, Antonio Johnson became free in 1651, and he had the means to purchase land, 250 acres. So that tells us he somehow acquired a bit of startup capital during his time of enslavement, which tells you something right then and there about the nature of slavery if he's able to accrue this much capital. So he purchases 250 acres and he grows crops, including tobacco. We do know that Antonio Johnson, in his when he became free, employed at least 5 white indentured servants, which is probably a mixture of white and black. And again, this tells us something about the nature of slavery. If a black man is able to hire out white indentured servants, we know that some of them were white. This tells us something about race relations, right? Now, one of his servants was a black man named John Casor. And John Casor, according to court records, is supposed to be freed somewhere around 1654. But an interesting turn, a twist happens in the case of John Casor. Anthony Johnson refused to free John Casor. He told him, "I don't care what your contract says. I don't care what your when your freedom dues are supposed to come in. Get back to work." Well, John Casor didn't think that was fair, so Casor walked away and is hired out by another man named Robert Parker. Well, Johnson sues Parker for the return of Casor. And this is what is interesting. Johnson's argument that this black man should be returned to his service, apparently interminably, is this: Casor is an African and therefore a slave for life. Wow. Okay. So if this is a confusing story to you, you're not alone, because the curious case of Antonio Johnson tells us a lot about American slavery, at least in its early phases in the Chesapeake. One is that slavery was not race based in 1619. Status was much more likely to be determined by religion than race. Christians not supposed to enslave other Christians. Also, slavery was not seen as permanent in 17th century or early 17th century Virginia. Johnson and others certainly became free after a time. How long was their service? We don't know. We also know that Antonio Johnson was able to accrue some startup cash during his time of enslavement and then purchase 250 acres once he became free. We can also see that blacks could hire out and, in some sense, own white labor as well as black labor. We know that Anthony Johnson did this. And so the color line had not been legally defined. But we see a shift in attitude in one man's lifetime. Johnson was an African from the area of Angola, and yet he became free. But when the time came to free his servant or slave, or however you want to put this, John Casor, in 1654, he denied him that same treatment, telling us a lot about the development of slavery in early 17th century Virginia. A Virginia slave law in 1670 says that free blacks and Native Americans who had been baptized are forbidden to buy Christian servants. The presence of this law tells us that before 1670, it had been happening. You don't pass laws to stop things that aren't happening. You pass laws to stop things that are happening. Otherwise, there don't need to be laws. Okay? Let's look a little bit closer at some of the documents that show us the development of slavery in America. So take a look at this first document, which is excerpted from the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. As you know, Barbados was a English colony, which was primarily used for the cultivation of sugar and then rice. and it was heavily dependent on slave labor for its continued operations. So let's look at this. If any Negro or slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to any Christian by striking or the like, such Negro or slave shall, for his or her first offense, be severely whipped by the constable. For his second offense of that nature, he shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in some part of his face with a hot iron. And being brutish slaves, they deserve not, for the baseness of their condition, to be tried by the legal trial of 12 men of their peers, as the subjects of England are. And it is further enacted and ordained that if any Negro or other slave under punishment by his master unfortunately shall suffer in life or member, which seldom happens, no person whatsoever shall be liable to any fine thereof. So, Barbados slave code meant to control the enslaved population. Now, here are a few things I want you to take note of. First, look at how the enslaved are described. 3 times within the document, Negro or slave, Negro or slave, and then at the bottom, Negro or other slave. Now ask yourself, why a distinction needs to be made? Why are we describing Negro or slave in this way? If, as you know, commonly my students think that blackness is somehow synonymous with slavery in the 17th century, that seems to not be the case, because there is a distinction being made. Why do I need to put them in the same class? And also look, Negro or slave, Negro or other slave, seems to suggest that there are slaves, or people considered slaves, other than those who are identified as Negro, right? And also look, there's an equality of punishment. There's a parity of punishment. It seems certainly a horrible punishment, being whipped and having your nose slit and things like that. But there is not a different punishment between those slaves that are identified as Negro and those slaves that are identified otherwise. So this document suggests to us that in the early 17th or in mid 17th century, there is not much of a legal distinction between enslaved people who are identified as Negroes and enslaved people who are identified as something else or other slave. There is a distinction, though: Christian. It seems that those who are not enslaved are identified as Christian. Free people are Christians. Curious distinction, right? So this second document that I want you to take note of is from the Virginia Slave Codes from December of 1662. It says, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be slave or free. Be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free according to the condition of the mother. Let's read that last part again. All children born in this country shall be held bond or free according to the condition of the mother. There are some things I want you to note about this document. The first is that doubts have arisen. And remember, I told you that laws are typically going to be reactionary rather than proactive. Usually laws are responding to something that is happening, or some question that is out there. This is certainly one of those occasions. Doubts have arisen. People are wondering. In other words, there are children walking around who have been the result of a relationship, probably not a consensual one, by a Englishman with a black woman. And questions are out there whether or not we should regard this person as a slave or as a free person. And so the assembly is answering this question, following in the condition of the mother. Now, what this does effectively is it makes slavery hereditary. It means that if your mother was a slave, you are a slave. Notice it's not in the condition of the father, because quite often the father is going to be the legal owner, so to speak. And so we can't go around, producing heirs or producing freemen or somebody that might make a claim on the father's property. So it follows in the condition of the mother, allowing, presumably, the white man to get away with this. This last one I want you to look at is from the Virginia slave laws, just a few years later, September of 1667. It reads, whereas some doubts have risen whether children that are slaves by birth and made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism should by virtue of their baptism be made free. It is enacted and declared by this grand assembly and the authority thereof that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom, that diverse masters freed from this doubt may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, those slaves, those of greater growth if capable, to be admitted to that sacrament. Let's pause on this one again and dissect it, analyze it, and pull it parts apart. Once again, we want to note that doubts have arisen, meaning there are people in Virginia that are beginning to question whether or not children that have been slaves their entire lives, but have converted to Christianity, made partakers of the sacrament of baptism. Should those people be made free? I mean, there is some suggestion in the Gospels that one cannot hold another Christian brother in bondage, and that's been generally the understanding of the church, and this has been the understanding of slave holders up to this point, that one of the justifications for enslaving somebody from Africa or somewhere else is that they are not Christian. And what if they become Christian? What if they declare that they accept Jesus and they want to be baptized? Well, that would make them free, right? Well, not so fast, says the Virginia slave laws. Just because you convert and become a Christian, it doesn't make you free. You're in the same position that you always were. And so the document, so it says, well, therefore, since they're not free, not if you become a Christian or not, slave owners may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting them to be admitted to the sacrament. So they may be encouraged to convert to Christianity because it may save their souls. But it does not alter their condition here on earth.